So I think that this explosion of the Dragon capsule may be a much bigger setback than people may have been thinking. And there are several reasons for this. The first one is usually Elon Musk is very upfront about the failures of SpaceX. You know, rocket blew up. That's what happens when you're learning, that sort of thing. In this case, there's none of it. And you can maybe see why. If this footage is real and there's been no one come forward to say that it's not, this is a real problem. This is the emergency abort system. This has to be one of the most reliable systems on the entire spacecraft. If there's a problem with the spacecraft, this is the one that saves your life. And if you light it up and it blows up the spacecraft, this is a real problem. And that, in many ways, would be the most optimistic outcome, in that if this thing's actually docked with the International Space Station and you have this same problem, you're looking at destroying the space station as well. Now, that being said, these are not new problems to the development of the design of spacecraft. So I'm going to take you on a little walk back through history, because some of this stuff is just fascinating. And I'm going to start way back. All of these new spacecraft are basically clones of the designs that came out of the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo era. And I'm going to start with this thing, because this thing is absolutely awesome. This is the 4-inch flight. What was the 4-inch flight? It was the flight that went 4 inches. Now, this is a Redstone rocket. It's nothing more than an extended V2. The V2, which was used to... Nazi Germany was firing these things at Britain. The V2 would come up to about here. This is almost exactly the same rocket. The guts of it down here are exactly the same. It's just got somewhat bigger fuel tanks. And this was the bit that was going to take the first Americans into space. And if anything goes wrong with the rocket, this is the bit that's going to take our plucky little astronaut in here to safety. So, let's see what happens. And... yay! I'm safe! I'm safe! So this is one of the most depressing things to look at if you're potentially going to be a astronaut who's going to fly in this rocket. The system that's going to take you to safety is the exact thing that fails. And this thing was an absolute disaster for NASA at the time, because you've now got a fully fueled rocket sat on the pad, completely unsupported, and if they had an astronaut in there, they would be really screwed. How do you get them out? And it turns out what had happened is there's a sensor somewhere in here that says, I've got to the right altitude, it's time to fire off the emergency abort system, because that's not needed, we're high enough now. And then it triggers the parachute mechanism, or I forget why it triggers the parachute mechanism actually, but that was the reason that all of this went wrong. Is there was a sensor trip that says, I've reached the altitude, shut off the main engines and fire away the emergency abort system. And then they had all these problems of what to do with this thing sat on the pan. They debated all sorts of things about shooting holes in it, because if it falls over at this point, there's just going to be a massive explosion. Well, fairly big explosion. Certainly, it would set back the Americans this was their launch pad at the time. And then this move, the design of this thing zigzags forward somewhat until you get to the command module. You go through Gemini into the command module. And in the early days of the Mercury capsules, the doors were designed to open outwards such that the astronaut could get out quickly if he needed to. And they even had exploding bolts on them, until one of these missions where it had landed in the water, and the astronaut either, I think it was Gus Grissom actually, he either accidentally nudged the emergency fire switch, or it malfunctioned. Either way, it blew the door off while it was in the ocean. The the Mercury capsule then sank, almost drowned the astronaut. And after this, they had this big hand-wringing thing. Right, from now on, no more doors that open outwards. We're going to have doors that open inwards, which is what they had on the command module. And this was what killed the astronauts in the Apollo 1 fire. So the Apollo 1 fire, they were just sat on top of the rocket, no fuel in the rocket. They're just testing the systems out. And while they were testing it to make sure it was all airtight, they'd actually overpressured the capsule, which was their first problem, which means that there was no way that they could have actually opened the doors against the pressure in the capsule in any event. And their second mistake was they had a pure oxygen atmosphere here, which means everything burns insanely well. I'm still stunned to this day that there was such an obvious mistake made that they had a pure oxygen atmosphere at 1 atmosphere in this capsule. Anyway, so once the fire starts, the pressure in the capsule goes up to 6 bar, I think, before the capsule actually sort of ruptures. The people inside, they die from the carbon monoxide fumes very quickly. And after this, they decide, okay, from now on, the doors are going to open outwards. And you might think that... So let's take a look at the emergency abort system on the Apollo. So this was one of their command modules, and this was the little rocket. They're going to fire it up, and then the plan is that at some point it's going to activate the emergency abort system, and the emergency abort system is going to carry the command module to safety. However, that's not quite what happens here. So everything goes well with the launch, and sometime after launch, there's actually a genuine malfunction with the rocket, and the rocket starts to twist. Rocket shouldn't be twisting like this. That's actually a malfunction in the rocket. And the way these things usually worked is they were incredibly crude. They had 2 wires. In fact, it might have been 3 sets of wires that go the whole length of the rocket. And if you break more than 2 of them, that triggers the emergency abort system. So what actually happens is the rocket disintegrates, and that triggers the emergency abort system. So it was actually a genuine failure of the rocket that triggered this. So in many ways, it was the most successful test you could possibly imagine. Well, they didn't really quite plan to have the rocket disintegrate like that. Anyway, after it lifts the capsule to safety, the emergency abort system falls to Earth, and parachutes open up on the command module. Everyone is safe. Now, of course, the astronauts watching all of this had been doing so. This was at the height of the space race, the height of the Cold War. And there was all sorts of drive to be the first person into space, the first into orbit, the first on the moon, and so forth. But nonetheless, I've seen several of the interviews for the astronauts, and they knew this was kind of a developing technology. And there were some wonderful accounts I've seen of someone sort of saying, yeah, this is the rocket that I'm going to be launching on in 6 months' time. Do you want to go see the launch? To his parents, and they go watch the launch, and the rocket sort of basically falls over and explodes, making life a little awkward. You know, don't worry about it. I'm sure they'll have the bugs worked out in 6 months' time. So there were lots of very impressive failures. But this is essentially the learning curve. And this is, of course, what paved the way for all of the modern rocketry. So when you take a look at what SpaceX is actually doing here, it really is an incremental advance on all of this. This is where the bulk of the knowledge was actually gained for doing this sort of thing. And even at that, you might think the Apollo missions, they were all a screaming success, yeah? Turns out almost all of them had incidents that could have killed most of the people. The one that everyone's familiar with, of course, is Apollo 13, where it's life and death the whole way. But, starting with Apollo 1, so this is the rough Apollo schematic. You launch, you go into orbit, you go into a transfer orbit, you dock the command module and service module, you get to the moon, you detach the lunar module, goes down, lands on the surface, the ascent engines fire, you come up, you dock, again, these really risky maneuvers, and then you transfer the astronauts back to the command module, fire up the service module engines, takes you all back, and you come back safe. What could possibly go wrong? Well, with the Apollo 1, that's when they had the fire on the pad, killed 3 of the astronauts. They had a big rethink at NASA about just how much risk they were putting the astronauts at by really rushing this. And after that, they became a lot more less cavalier about how they were doing things. But even at that, a lot of the early Apollo missions, the rocket, the Saturn V or the Saturn, the Saturn 1B? I've forgotten now. But a lot of the rockets that they launched on, the vibrations on the early rocket launches were so severe that they really couldn't read anything in the capsule because of the rocket vibrations. Later on, they got some of that sorted out. So Apollo 10, they get all the way to the moon. They descend the lunar module. They don't have enough fuel to land, so they're just testing out the ascent engine. So they're going to detach the ascent portion, and they're going to come up to redock with the command module. And when they do that, it turns out there's a mistake made, and the ascent part of the lunar module starts tumbling because all the commands are being duplicated or something. And there are no seats in the lunar module. So fairly quickly, if this thing starts spinning, you can't hold on to the controls. You're thrown about the cabin. And so they really only have a few seconds to get this back under control. And there's actually video of it, really quite dramatic when you understand just how close these guys are to dying. And they have a few seconds to work out what the problem is and get it back under control, because if they don't, they're going to crash into the lunar surface. So that was the desperate part of Apollo 10. Apollo 11, of course, they all get down to the lunar surface. But whilst getting in and out of the lunar module, they managed to knock off the arm switch for the ascent engine. Now, they need to flip that switch, otherwise they can't come home. And in the end, the way that they solve this problem is by sticking a biro, I kid you not, they stick a biro into the switch and manage to flick the switch that way. And after that, curiously enough, they redesign where this switch was. Apollo 12 was struck twice by lightning on launch, which completely resets the guidance, the command module, which had never been tested before. And luckily for them, it all just comes back and it all works fine. But a complete roll of the dice. Apollo 13, of course, is the desperate one where they have an explosion on the service module during the transfer orbit, and they do the free return orbit. They almost run, they get poisoned, they start running into problems with getting poisoned by carbon dioxide. The module starts to freeze, they've not got enough power. They shut down the command module, not fully knowing whether it'll actually wake up again when they come back. So, massive roll of the dice, and they get really lucky there. Apollo 14, they're in the transfer, or they get to about this point, and they've got to dock the command module and the lunar module, and it won't work. And they try loads of times to do this, and eventually the way they get it to work is they basically not quite ram one spacecraft into the other, but they thrust one spacecraft into the other and sort of dock it manually. So that solves the problem at this point, but you've now got the problem that when you undock at this point, the guys go down to the moon. At some point, they've got to come up and you've got to redock. What if you can't redock? What if you have the same problem again? Well, after some hand-wringing, they decide they're going to go for it. And in the end, they could have always spacewalked across if things got really desperate. Again, not really quite what you want to be doing. Apollo 15, they had some problem with the service module engine, but on the way back, there's a water leak, and they don't really work out where the water is coming from. But again, if you're in a spacecraft with lots of mission-critical systems, having water leaking all over the place is kind of a problem. Apollo 16, they again have problems. There's only one engine that gets you back to Earth, and that's the service module engine. And when they undock the two, the service module engine has a malfunction where it looks like it's about to fire, which would be really bad news. And so after that, they sort of never use that bank of controls again out of fear that it'll fire the service module engine. But other than that, it all goes fairly well. And I think Apollo 17 is the only one where it kind of goes by the numbers. So yeah, there was an awful lot of learning how to do this stuff while they were doing it. And the sad thing is, a lot of this knowledge is kind of lost. When you have the knowledge base, when you have the engineers and the technicians who actually build these systems, they can just move from doing it they can build you another one quite easily. However, after this, NASA goes on to the space shuttle, and during this time, all the knowledge of how to directly build this is kind of lost. Which now brings us on to when the space shuttle is decommissioned, America does not have the ability to put men into space until they now have whatever these two companies, Boeing with the Starliner and SpaceX with the Dragon. They both are basically clones of the command module. There's really not a lot new in all of this. The Dragon is in many ways the more interesting, and I never really quite appreciated this, that it uses the same engines for the emergency abort as it does for the deorbiting burn. Now, the deorbiting burn, turns out almost everyone uses dinitrogen tetroxide and hydrazine. It's used for the Soyuz capsule. It was used for the space shuttle deorbiting engines. But to have these things blow up is an absolute showstopper. Until you work out what exactly it is that went wrong with these things, I really don't see SpaceX moving forwards. Yeah, if you enjoyed that, drop a like on the video and hit subscribe. And thanks for watching.